Hello everybody, my name is Sam Gregory and I was originally going to be giving a talk on the Fotospeed stand at the photography show, but for obvious reasons we all know that has been postponed until later in the year. And the talk was about how to know which paper to choose for which image. And I'd chosen 4 particular images, 2 colour, 2 black and white, and each of them had their own sort of peculiarities, for want of a better word, that in my mind lent them towards particular papers. And I was hoping that anyone who's an advancing photographer or who's starting to print, or who prints a bit already but's curious about why there are different papers and what the different papers might be suitable for, that you'd be able to get an idea based on my examples of what might suit in different occasions. Now, the Fotospeed people called and they said, hey, can you repurpose your talk into a video? And I sort of said, kind of, because originally the idea was to have them all printed out, sort of 16 images in total, 4 times 4 papers. And we were going to have people just looking at them and I was going to talk and it's going to be quite touchy-feely. Now, obviously, that's not happening. So in the video, I'm going to do my best to give you some close-ups of the prints so you can see them. And I'm also probably going to talk more about the differences I see and I feel, and a little bit more about the technical side, because obviously we're doing this via video rather than in person. So that's a brief outline of what we're going to do. And if that's interesting to you, if you want to see about the different papers and a little bit about file prep, then stick with me for the next few minutes. So first up, in terms of the technicals, there are a couple of things that we probably need to cover. Some of you may already be fully aware of this, but I wanted to give a little bit of advice, because for those that are starting out or haven't got as much experience printing, then these are 2 things which are going to really help you get what you see on the screen out onto what you get in the paper. Now, that's the most common thing I hear at workshops and events and etc. is I can't get what I see on the screen onto the paper. Now, there's 2 things that you have to be doing right to give yourself the most likelihood of those things happening. First up, you need to be calibrating your screen. Now, that's a very easy thing to do, and millions of you and hundreds of you, however many, may be doing that already. So don't scream at the screen. I won't spend too long on it, but something like the Spider 5 Pro comes with software, and essentially that calibrates your monitor to understand the colors that it's putting out and the ambient light in the room, and it will adjust the monitor so that what you're seeing is a lot closer to what you're going to get. So that's basic first step number 1. Second step is ICC profiles. Now, I'm not going to try and bore you here because I don't profess to be any sort of an expert, but it's very important that each paper has its own profile, and that when you communicate that through Lightroom or Photoshop or however you're printing, that you can select the profile that suits the paper to print the image, and that tells the printer how to deliver the color and the rate and the density and everything else. Now, there's a step above that though, because there are generic ICC profiles which you can download from your Fotospeed website, so to speak, and there are custom profiles, and the custom profile is specific to your printer. And I'm going to jump onto the computer and I'm going to show you a couple of differences and why it's really, really important and easy to get a custom profile, and that will give you a fuller, richer print, and it will be closer to what you expect it to be, because as I've mentioned, that is always the goal. So let's just jump onto the computer and touch on that just briefly, and then we'll get into the images as well. Okay, so let's have a look at color profiles, and let's have a look at the 4 papers that we're going to have today. Now look, I understand you see this and you think, oh my God, what's he going to talk about? I've lost interest, or I can't cope with it. Don't worry, I am not Mr. Technical. I've had to find this out myself, and I've had to use it in practice, and now I understand it to some degree. I want to share that because it really helps you wrap your head around it, especially if you are a visual sort of a learner. So this is a sort of 3D representation of the profile of a particular paper. In this case, NST Bright White. And I mentioned that profiles are generic and they can be designed for a certain printer and a certain paper, or you can get a customized profile which not only considers the brand of the printer, but it is your physical printer. And so Fotospeed can create you for free a customized ICC profile and we're going to touch on why that is really important in a moment, all right? So just please do bear with me on this. Before we get into the profiles too deeply, I want to just quickly walk through the papers that we're going to be using today and a couple of the specs. So platinum etching, which is a 285 thickness, that has a natural white base, a textured surface, it's the most textured of the four we're going to look at, and the paper itself is a mix of cotton and alpha cellulose, and it has a whiteness rating of 93. Now, whiteness measures paper in the same way that the eyes see it. So this whiteness measurement, it measures the ability of paper to reflect all colours of light, okay? Now, if we carry on to our next paper, and I'm going to come back to that point, NST Bright White, 315 thickness, so it's a bit thicker than the etching. It has a very bright white base, gentle textured surface, so less texture than the platinum etching. The paper is 100% cotton, and it has a whiteness rating of 99.5, which obviously is very high, compared to, say, the 93 on the platinum etching. So again, whiteness measures the ability of paper to reflect all colours of light. The third paper we're going to look at is Smooth Cotton 300. It has a 100% cotton base, and the paper is 100% cotton. It's pH neutral, ultra smooth surface, and it can take a huge, the highest level, in fact, of ink load in the Fotospeed range. So therefore it's good for high saturation. It has a whiteness rating of 94. Now the fourth and final paper, and then we'll jump back to the ICC profiles and why they're important, is Platinum Baryta 300. So it's a 300 thickness. This is a newly improved, modified paper. So the Baryta has been recently changed. Natural white, smooth, unglazed surface. So it's sort of towards a gloss, but not glossy. That's technical, isn't it? And it has a very wide Dmax, so capacity to take a huge range of tonal difference from the very black blacks to the very white whites. It has a slightly cooler physical look to it than, for example, the smooth cotton, which looks a little bit warmer. And the Platinum Baryta has a whiteness rating of 100, which obviously is assumed as high as you can get. So that's all very good, and it sounds like a lot of tech specs. What does that physically mean? Let's look at the ICC profiles. And what I want to do is point out a couple of differences. So here we've got generic profiles, which are, as I've said, generic to a particular printer, not mine, just a generic Canon printer, the Pro 1000 in this case. And what I want to do is just have a look at the Baryta. And what this 3D modelling allows us to do is look at what this paper can deliver in terms of the blackest blacks up to the white whites and all the colours around it, okay? So here we have the capacity for a lot of low-end colour delivery. A lot of dark blacks can be delivered and discerned on this particular paper. If we look at the platinum etching, you can see there's a huge difference in those two. And suddenly we've lost a lot of the information down here, which essentially means it can't deliver as many of the blacks and such a gradation and such a density of it as well. And if we just hold that one and then we put the Baryta one back over it, you can see, can't you, that there's a huge difference. In fact, if we clear that, and if we just hold this one, that might be an easy way to do it, and then we look at the platinum etching, it lives very much inside it. So in theory, you would say, well, I'm going to go for the Baryta every day of the week. It's got the capacity to give me lots more contrast, lots more blacks, lots more colour, lots more everything. But it isn't quite that simple, as we're going to find out. Let's clear that. Now, one of the reasons why it's not quite that simple is all we're doing here is looking at a generic profile. Now, I've mentioned if you can actually get a customized profile, which Fotospeed will do for free, and there's details of how to do that on their website, you will find a custom profile makes printing a lot more efficient because it uses the ink properly and it delivers it in a more efficient way through your printer, but also it allows you more range than a generic profile. So to see that, let's compare this platinum etching generic profile with the platinum etching custom profile I have had done by Fotospeed. So let's have a look at this. And we said earlier we were a bit concerned there's not as much going on down here. Boom. That's with my customized profile. I've done nothing, Fotospeed did it all, but it goes to show that paper has more capacity if you get the customized profile, and that will result in prints which have more flexibility to take those tonal and contrast changes, and it will mean more efficiency, so less use of ink. And there's a third thing, it will mean, going back to our original point, that you will have a far better chance of getting the print that you see on the screen, or the image you see on screen, to print in a similar way onto the paper when you print it out. And you would choose this custom profile at the point where you print, and it would deliver it in the most efficient way and the most realistic way to what you have on the image on the screen. Right. Hopefully I've not lost anybody there with that. I know that's a bit of a deep dive, but I wanted to take the opportunity video gives us to sort of get into that and show you it, to physically see that difference. So again, that's the generic, and that is a customized version, which you can see gives more data. So let's get off the computer and let's get back actually into the images themselves. Okay, so we've covered a little bit there about ICC profiles and about the 4 different papers that we're going to be testing out today. So now let's get into the images. There are 4 images, 2 colour, 2 black and white, and I picked 2 different types of colour and 2 different types of black and white images to show some of the differences and the flexibilities, shall we say, within the paper. So first up, in the colour, I wanted to go for something quite subtle, quite muted, with very little texture in the image, and something that within the histogram is quite closely bunched up together. And just to give you some idea, also towards the far right side, the higher or the brighter end of the histogram, I want to give you some idea how that would then render into print. So on each image we're going to go through them in the same order, and I'll talk about the relative benefits or not of each paper on each image as we go. Now this image, as I mentioned already, is quite subtle. It doesn't have heavy amounts of physical items in it. Now there are obviously huge mountains, but they're a long way away. So as a percentage of the frame, that strip of mountains is maybe 15% of the frame. The rest of it is blocks of subtle muted tones in a way. So we have the sky, the sort of darker sky cloud, the sunset, which is a very muted sunset, and that was the whole point. And then we have this foreground here, which is other mountains. And really, at the time of capture, I envisaged this and I captured it as a very soft, gentle, sort of dreamy sort of a sunset, as opposed to the sort of all singing, all dancing, crazy sunsets that sometimes you might see. So with that in mind, the fact that there's all these areas of basically nothing, for want of a better word, I don't feel like the textured papers, for example, this platinum etching, which is the most textured of the 4 here, I don't think they really suit that, because what you have is just a very textured, dappled sort of look all throughout the frame. And even when you look closely, obviously it's even more obvious, but even at 6 feet away, you can see a slight difference. Now let's just move through this, and we go to the NST Bright White. Now this is still slightly textured, but less than the platinum etching, and this does a pretty nice job of it. What we're looking for are the transitions between the light and the dark here, and I'm trying to see how much texture is in this foreground as well. So not bad, but again, close up, I can see that texture in the paper, and just for this image, that is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something quite a lot smoother. So with that in mind, the 2 really that work best for me are the Smooth Cotton 300, which is this one here, and the Platinum Baryta as well. Now, I appreciate it's very difficult to see back to back through here on the video, but I'm going to hopefully get a close-up and demonstrate and talk a little bit more about that. I personally choose the Smooth Cotton here because it is the most subtle of the 2. The Baryta, if we just pop that up, the foreground and the darker area here at the top feel quite heavy to me, and there's still quite a lot of detail here in this mountainous area. And the recession of the mountains, for me, the glory of that is I want that to sort of vanish, to softly, gently disappear. And for me, the brighter actually keeps too much detail in a weird way, and it's perhaps too contrasty and dark. Bearing in mind these came off exactly the same sort of file. So the winner here, as I say, is the smooth cotton, simply because I think it does the best job of gentle transitions, keeping the softness, keeping the calmness throughout the image. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to move on to the next colour image, which is quite different. Okay, so this is our second colour image, and you can see, and through the histogram as well, we've got a lot more going on in this image, tonally and texture-wise, compared to the first colour image. So you can see from sort of left to right, it's packed full of data, this file, both in terms of brightness and darkness, and also in terms of colour as well. So this actually is autumn, I should point out. The other image was summer, albeit dusk in the summer in the Dolomites. This is autumn in the New Forest. So late-ish autumn, mid-November. So you're getting these sort of real rusty colours, and the scene is chaotic. And we're going to come to maybe why that's interesting in a moment. So let's just walk through each one in a bit more detail though. This is the platinum etching, and in theory, and I believe in practice, this very textured surface suits this very textured scene. The two things go nicely together, and you really feel the sort of crunch of some of these drying autumnal leaves in the platinum etching. Now we'll just walk through, and I'll come back to which I prefer and why. The NST Bright White, which has a very white base, obviously, I find it's an excellent all-round paper. It tends to make things pop quite nicely, so the brightness in it is very good. Again, does a good job. It's got a sort of subtle texture to it, so not quite that crunchy texture of the platinum etching. So not bad, nice all-round, you know, perfectly happy with that. The smooth cotton here sort of goes against what I've just said, and that's always a dangerous thing to commit to video, but what I mean by that is the smooth nature of the finish actually, weirdly, also works as well as the textured nature of the finish as well. That is very much a personal choice. Why I like it though is that there's a reduction in the contrast here. The darks don't feel as dark to me, and you can especially see that in some of these dark green areas here in the bottom. And also what I like about the smooth cotton rendition here is that the twigs, the brighter, whiter, lighter twigs up here in the top right, really there's a clarity to them, and they're not too contrasty. And I think initially you might think as a photographer you want some separation here between the foreground and the background. However, I think in the desire for separation, actually you end up just making it too heavy, and the darks become too dark and the contrasts become too contrasty. So although this isn't my final pick for this image, I do appreciate the fact that that lack of contrast in the smooth cotton on this particular image actually allows just a single plane of colour and interest, which I actually quite like about it. The warmth of the smooth cotton as well. It's not quite as white as the NST Bright White, or it's not quite as cool as the Baryta, for example, and the warmth does suit, obviously, an autumnal scene. And here we have the Baryta. Now, I've mentioned already, it's very much personal preference, but I find this a bit too contrasty, a bit too crunchy. The darks are a bit too dark, and as I said, you can see that especially down in these areas as well. And some of the bark on the trees feels a little dark as well. So strangely, although often we're told we want contrast and we're looking for rich contrasty images, for me, this slightly lighter, less contrasty, subtle palette also works here, which is the smooth cotton. However, my pick is in fact the platinum etching here. I do really like the texture. The textured surface of the paper suits the textured nature of the paper as well. So interesting, all four would be fine, and again, it depends what you prefer. But let's get on, now we've done the colour, let's get on to a couple of totally different black and white images to have a look at as well. Okay, so let's get into the black and white images, and I've picked two totally different black and white images to really stretch the paper and test what they can do. Now, this particular one is quite sort of high key, if you will. It's a snowy scene, also from the Dolomites. You can tell I'm a bit of a Dolomites fan. It was shot very far to the right-hand side on the histogram to gather as much data as possible. But also, I knew when I wanted to print this that the colour and the brightness of it and the pure white nature of it was really critical to the image working. That was my number one concern. My second concern was to have some nice detail here in the trees. So texture and really that granular fineness that you get when you have very fine snow. I wanted to capture that in the print. But as I say, I'll come back to this point. The big point for me with snow and with any snow images is I want that white to be really white. Now that's my personal preferences. People might have a different opinion on what they like, but let's just walk through the particular images, the particular papers, sorry. So first up, as usual, we've got the platinum etching. Now that really hits the brief for point 2, which is to get that real texture and crunch of snow, if you will, into the tree line because of the very textured nature of the surface of platinum etching. However, this is not white, okay? There is a certain, there's kind of a dark's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. We're not at pure white, and that's simply because the paper isn't as white, doesn't have as white a base as NST bright white, funnily enough. Now, this is my pick here. We'll look at the other two as well, but this is always my pick for any snow images such as this. It really does get the snow as white as it possibly can be, and it still retains some nice texture here in the trees because there is a slight texture to the paper. So for me, in these scenes, NST Bright White cannot go wrong. A really easy paper to print with as well. Doesn't need much faffing about. Once you've got your calibration and your ICC profile, you're away. And don't be scared to really push the file right up to the far right-hand side of the histogram and it can still cope with it. Let's just quickly look at the others as well. And I'll try and show you on the close-ups the difference, although that's very difficult because the color profile of the camera that I'm using, how your screen is color profiled and calibrated, it's going to be very difficult without physically seeing it yourself. But you know, just trust me. Smooth cotton does a pretty good job. You do still have some texture here, even though the surface is smooth. But again, there is a slight coloring of the snow. Not quite as much as there is though with the Baryta. Now, if we just have a look at the Baryta for a moment, it is sort of more of a traditional black and white print, shall we say, sort of a darkroom print, for want of a better phrase. And there is this sort of slight wash on it because of that. Not a technical wash, but you know what I'm saying. And so suddenly this area up here starts to feel a little darker and the trees feel quite heavy and dense. Whereas if we flick back to the bright white, which is this one here, hopefully you can see that there is quite a big difference in these two. Now these retain the clarity and there is still black, but it's black and white, not sort of shades of grey. Now the Baryta is going to have its moment, so I appreciate it hasn't won anything yet, but we're going to come to that. But on these very high key, bright scenes, NST Bright White cannot beat it. All right, massive fan of that. It's my favourite paper for this sort of stuff especially. Okay, so that's that one over with. Let's get into our next black and white, which is a lot more contrasty. Okay, so final image. Thank you if you've made it this far. Hopefully it's been useful for you. This is obviously very different to our last black and white image. This really is lots of black and some white, but at each end of the histogram scale, there's not a huge amount in between. It's either black or it's white. And so it was a really good test, I think, for the different papers. Now, all of the matte papers can take different amounts of black and will have more in it. The one that probably has the least capacity to deliver lots of deep blacks in terms of what ICC profile looks like is the platinum etching. However, this actually did a pretty good job. You'll have to excuse, there's a couple of marks here, which has happened here in transit, but it's done a pretty good job. And actually the texture up in the cloud is quite nice. And there is a sort of slight gradation here from slightly lighter black to black up at the top. and the black in the window. So not a bad job. Platinum etching can do black and white, despite the fact it looks like on the ICC profile it doesn't deliver a huge amount of deep blacks. NST Bright White I actually use for a lot of black and white punchy images as well. And again, you can see it's done a really nice job here. A little bit of texture, but the black's rendered really nicely. It does, I find, make the contrast between the black and a white pop. So this image was already taken with a polarizer, which helps that sort of differentiation between the clouds and the sky. And when I took the image using the polarizer, I really wanted that huge contrast pop between the cloud, the building, and the sky, black and white, as it were. So NST Bright White does a very good job on it. Smooth cotton, yes, it's a slightly warmer paper, and because of that, the black, it's an odd thing to say, it isn't as black as I would like it to be. And I think if you compare it to the NST Bright White, again, really difficult to see on the video, I do appreciate that, but just trust me, the black feels a bit deeper and blacker. It's a really stupid thing to say, I know, but so that would be my comment on the smooth cotton. Fine, but probably not the best one for this image. And then we have the baryta. Now, I will say this, I am commonly a fan of the matte papers. Okay, so rarely do I use a baryta paper. I know some people do, and some people use it on color as well as black and white. I can see the appeal, and I think on this particular black and white one, it does work really nicely. The black is black, and they really are deep blacks, and this paper can give the deepest blacks of all the papers I think that we've covered here as well. So if you do have something where there's a heavy, dense black that you want delivered, or even a range of blacks, and again, that sounds stupid, black is black, but you know what I mean, a gradation of darkness on that tone, then the baryta is definitely worth a look. And for the purpose of the video, I'm giving it the win on this particular image. However, I would say probably NST Bright White is an excellent option if you just physically prefer the matte finish of a paper. So those are our 4 images. One final thing I would just like to point out. Some people have asked me, do you really need different papers for different images? You know, isn't that expensive? You're stocking, so to speak, lots of different things at home. The answer is it's no more expensive in some way than just ploughing through one of a single paper. So I don't really follow that argument. I tend to stick to 2, maximum 3 papers. That's just my personal opinion. There are photographers out there that just use 1. Now that could be just because they're really comfortable with printing on it, and or they shoot in a particular style that always suits that paper. You've seen my work is kind of fairly eclectic in terms of the palette and the tonal values within it. So I do find some flexibility on paper is useful. I would point out that if you're not sure, there are sample packs that you can buy from Fotospeed, and you can then try them at home. However, what I would say is definitely download the generic profile. Don't just go off whatever your printer's going to do and your computer's going to do. But if you can, try and get a custom profile as well. And you might need to commit to buying a box of paper, but then they will give you a free custom profile, which, as you've seen earlier on the 3D diagrams, will deliver you the most amount of ink in the most practical and efficient way as well. So I hope that's been useful. Different to what you might have found at the photography show, where you could have got up close and personal, so to speak. But thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I shall see you again sometime.